This is supposed to be a conversation about what we can look forward to or what we should be thinking about in terms of where we're going with all the research, understanding the whole child development, and how we're going to get beyond doing the same thing over and over again and digging a little bit deeper into the details. So to focus it a little bit, I'm going to throw out the word relationship. And the reason I'm going to throw out the word relation, not throw it out, but throw it towards you. The reason to put that on the table, I'm not going to throw it, I want to put it on the table. There's no table here, but pretend there is one. Is that all the work today that we heard about was about relationships, whether it was molecular relationships that are related to experiences that an individual is having, what Michael talked about, the relationships that Emran just scared all of us about. 99% of our DNA isn't our DNA, but the relationship of systems, the gut and the immune systems and other systems with the brain and vice versa. And the relationships that are so important at the whole organism level, at the level between a caregiver and their infant, and not even during pregnancy as well. So I'm going to start with, so that's the focus, relationships. And I'd like to see whether we can be really creative about the kinds of things that we think can be done. How do we get relationships into research at all these different levels? I'm going to start with Emran, just to sort of continue what you talked about. Why in the world do we have this relationship?
Well,
what is the point?
Yeah,
why make it so complicated?
Well, yeah, it is complicated, and clearly, I always like to emphasize we're pretty, scraping on the surface of probably 1% of understanding that system, and I think many claims that are made right now are not, evidence-based, but I think the relationship, I tried to make this clear, just based on the numbers. I mean, the duration of evolution of these microbes, and the number of genes that they have, and gene products, hundreds of thousands of metabolites that we don't know what they do. I think we almost have to assume that this has an important influence on us. We know that already about the heart, some major risk factor is TMAO that the microbes produce. We know it about obesity, metabolic syndrome. I think that the brain is actually has been the most challenging to determine if in humans what role this exactly plays. So for me, it's been helpful to sort of this microbiome science and trying to understand it. There's two approaches. Some people, like the pharmaceutical industry, still focus on one microbe and one molecule that they make. I think the only way to understand this completely, and this is where the future is going, to do these very massive analysis of 100,000 patients or individuals with machine learning approaches, artificial intelligence, to extract the patterns that are relevant for human disease. And I think that will happen. It's an ongoing process, not driven in academia, but driven by startup companies. But my guess is in 5 years we'll have the answer to that.
So we're going to have to become more interdisciplinary, because now we're going to have to talk to mathematicians and informaticists and engineers and signal processing people and all these people to make sense out of all this information.
Yeah, and you can tell that it's very difficult in an academic discipline, and I still feel this. I trained as a gastroenterologist and got into neuroscience, and then the neuroscience alone wasn't enough. Then you had to, get into the microbiome, and you will have to. I think in the future there will be teams of people that have these expertises that can work together to understand it. And the bioinformatics will probably be the most important part of it, I think.
Right. We're going to have to put that in the context of biology. So how do we do that in the context of relationships, Michael? I'm going to call on you before I call on Ruth to talk about the whole individual. How do we do this?
Right. Well, I think one of the things I was really taken by today is the very different nature of the discussion we're having here about dealing with children who require interventions, preventions. And the nature of the discussions that we have in traditional medicine and psychiatry, where the goal is to develop better medications for mental health disorders. On the side of developing medications, we've been notoriously ineffective. The last effective antidepressant that was developed in 1978.
Yeah.
So since then, there's been medications that are marginally better in terms of their reduced side effects. There's a new wave of medications in depression, the use of ketamine, for example, special K, the use of opiate agonists. It sounds like pharmacology a la Woodstock. So we're not really getting anywhere. And yet here you heard an incredibly optimistic set of presentations that spoke to programs that are evidence-based, they're based on good, strong observations, and they're effective in general, this seems. I think there are two challenges, and Phil Fisher raised one of them, which is the issue of scalability. And good on Phil in bringing that up, because that's where we need to get to. I mean, we need to hit the market, right? And that needs to get to children early. It needs to get to them when they're seen by services early on, usually in pediatrics, and it needs to be effective. So we need to scale. And the other challenge, I'll come back to the point, I think we need to target more effectively. So the relationship that we need to better understand is that between adverse circumstance and true, genuine risk. Because what we want to do is to target kids who are at risk, not simply in risky circumstances. And so this takes us to the point, Pat, where you and I are working, which is trying to understand the impact of adversity on the individual child and create measures that will allow us to understand, is this set of adverse circumstances truly having a major impact on that child? Because however that may seem a little bit quizzical to you, I mean, there's buffering systems that many kids have, right? That are there modulating the impact of these adverse events on the child. Many children are spared the effects of adversity.
So let me
because of
interrupt
these
for a moment,
relationships.
because Emran talked about doing work on 100,000 people, and you're talking about doing work on an individual at a time to really understand, because we know that there's heterogeneity and individual differences. Individual differences, what we heard about today, the response to the same adversity in an environment, or the responsiveness of an individual in terms of their relationship with their caregiver. They bring this stuff to the table. So we have the need to have an enormous amount of information to figure out the complexity of the system, but at the same time, we can't forget that we can't just take all that information, create an average, and then say, oh, well, here's what we're shooting for, right?
Well,
But it's actually not the average. It's so the hope is really this personalization.
Are you arguing with me? It's good.
No, because averages are not. Yeah, I mean, I think we're leaving that phase of clinical investigation that we want to look at averages. I think personalization is the catchword now, and individualization. So the hope is the big hope from the people that are investing a lot of money in these big data science of the microbiome and gene expression pattern is that you are able to identify subtypes of individuals that either have a high risk in the future to develop something, or that are particularly responsive to a certain intervention, either dietary or medication. So that's really, I think, the goal.
So how are we going to do this when you get to I mean, we're talking about levels of complexity, but I don't think there's anything more complex than really trying to understand human relationships, right? That it's complicated, and there are time dimensions and space, and and development is all about change over time. So it's a moving target, right? What's going on at 3 months is not necessarily right. So how are we going to scale this or think about this in a way that's going to be a game changer?
Right. So I was thinking today we heard about stress, toxic stress, early stress, adversity. And I think one of the goals for the future is to disentangle this concept. Like in my lab, we follow 3 cohorts of early stress from birth to now adolescence or young adulthood. One is premature infants, very stressful. Child is born prematurely, separation from the mother, a lot of stimuli in the NICU, That's one type of stress. And then another cohort are children who are exposed to war, live in a city called Sderot, is 10 kilometers from the Gaza border. They're bombed unpredictably for the past maybe 25 years. We follow them from birth to adolescence. And the third cohort is children exposed to chronic maternal depression. And no one stress, and we follow them, we take a lot of different measures. We take their brain and we take their hormones, and now we're starting to look at their microbiome and repeated observation of parenting, executive functions, regulatory functions, and no one stress resembles another. And I think we tend to say early adversity or early stress as one thing. And it's not. And within these kinds of different stresses, different child disposition or temperament or susceptibility play out differently. Even just to look at the HPA, the cortisol system. So children of depressed mothers between 6 and 12 months have a certain elevation and then it shuts down. Children exposed to war have a different pattern. Children who are premature have yet a different pattern and yet a different age. So I think we tended to lump together everything under the title of early adversity. And if you have 1 hit, 2 hits, 3 hits, and we didn't pay attention that there are different types of stress. And I think this is part of what we need to do for the future, just disentangle this concept of early stress and see how it affects the parent-child relationships, the child relationships with the peers, child social competencies, the hormones, the brain, etc.
So one of the things I was thinking about is, there probably aren't enough scientists or laboratories in the world to bring the numbers we're talking about and the approaches we're talking about into the laboratory. How do we become transformative and actually go back in some ways? The universities used to have lab schools, for example, and some still do, but not nearly as many. A lot of them are closed, where there's actually education and research going on in those lab schools, and that the educators, this is just one example, were actually part of the scientific team because they had a basic understanding of the research and the science going on, and allowed us to sort of get out of the mode of generating a lot of data, a lot of information in a research laboratory context, which may not be necessarily the reality. It seems like interventions certainly seem to be going that way, what we heard about today, that the research is going on in the community, or that's the goal, is to try to do more and more research in the community. Is that some of what you're going to be doing in your new home? You have people coming into the laboratory because you can't haul around an MR scanner on the back of your pickup truck to image, but there's other things that are coming online that we're going to be able to do outside of the conventional way we have been thinking about research. Come to my laboratory on my university campus and participate. Is that something that you've thought about?
We've done much of our work in the homes. I think perhaps this is because Israel is a relatively small country, and even if you have to go far away, it's not more than 2 hours away. Intervention for depressed moms were always in the home because they have such a hard time getting themselves together and coming to the lab. And I think there will be more and more research going on in the community, especially as we're building devices that are more mobile. You can now image children. There are mobile EEG and FNIRS, and you could certainly collect.
Yeah. What do you guys think?
I think Mark Brackett was touching on this. There's one of the really nice things, obviously, that you hear today that you don't get in a classical medical setting is that people are talking about both the educational context and the mental health context, and they're talking about the interface between the two. And preschools are an ideal place to be doing that. And I think there is an increasing appreciation, for example, that academic achievement is reliant on the skills that we're speaking of. EQ, for example, executive functions, etc. the school setting, the preschool setting in particular, represents an incredible opportunity to be able to look at kids faced with a particular challenge, as well as to look at social relationships, et cetera. I think part of this is adapting our research protocols to real-life situations. Digital world is giving us enormous opportunities to be able to do that. We heard, again, some examples of that over the course of today's talk, both with Sonia and with Mark. I think scaling that down to children is increasingly interesting. I mean, how many know of 4-year-olds who are not digitally attuned, et cetera, for good or bad? Well, if they're doing it, let's collect data, right? And I think there are ways of being able to take
Are they going
that
to be a
into real life.
co-author on the papers?
Yeah, we'll get a footnote.
We'll
to
get-
that.
okay.
Yeah, acknowledgement. But I think there are ways of being able to go into real life situations and collect that type of data about measures that are meaningfully predictive.
Can we do that outside of the? Can we do
Yeah,
that
yes,
with-
I mean, just some examples that, that I've run into and that, partially incorporating. So you don't have to go into the, the clinical studies unit and have your blood drawn. You can do a pinprick of your finger and send it in, and
You can go to the washroom.
Yeah. Get the complete analysis, everything. So for few and fewer things, you actually have to come to the clinical study center. You don't have to do a complex assessment by the dietitian. You can take, there's apps that you can photograph whatever you eat, and it will calculate all the details of it. You can have wearable devices that measure your activity, which part of the house you spend most of your time in, how your sleep is. So there's more and more of those techniques available. And I think that allows to do this on a very large number of people, which you could not do, bring them in and, very expensive with study coordinators. I mean, I've been amazed, and really this has changed my view on this, how some of these companies now that are aiming for this phenotyping of comprehensive phenotyping, how many of these techniques that they're adapting. I mean, it's really mind-boggling. Every time that we said, well, could we do this in collaboration? They said, well, no, we don't need you guys. We need you as consultants, but we can do everything, digitally. I think there's clearly a paradigm shift of how to do studies in a large number of individuals.
But I think
Yeah, go ahead.
just to complement it, but I think the paradigm shift is not just the technology, which obviously enables us to do it, but also the realization that that real life is important, that understanding people's brain response and behavior and mental health in their context, in their own ecology is
Absolutely.
important. So we want to see kids in the playground and kids in the street and kids in the classrooms and kids with their parents and their grandparents. So the paradigm shift is also on understanding that real life really matters, and we should study that if we want to understand the origins of mental health.
Well, the other thing that I heard today, and I think that the fellows of the Institute have been learning about this, is that these components that focus on the brain and cognitive, social, emotional functions are integrated, right? And they are important to understand from a developmental context that these are related, and that measures that are siloing them into one category or another are not going to be very meaningful without understanding really what's going on in those integrated components. And that's really getting at your issue, I think, of real life, right? Because there's we heard it earlier this afternoon on the panel. I think Pat mentioned this. We used to think about brain parts,
Right.
Functioning in sort of a unidimensional, isolated way, and we know that doesn't work at all that way. And now we have to deal with the uncomfortable fact that, we have our gut. And so my grandmother was right when she complained about me. You're eating my kishkas out, she used to say. Certain things you remember when you're a 4-year-old, and she can't get you into dinner. Anyway, that's too much information for the group. So we have the technology that's coming on board. We know that we're collecting more and more information. Sometimes I get the sense that we're sort of also at the same time sort of defaulting back to just generating encyclopedias of information, right? And what are we going to do with all of this information? Who's going to have the capacity, or how are we going to do this? What's the science going to look like in the context of who's going to be doing that science? Does it need to all turn into, or a lot of it turning into team science?
Yeah, inevitably it's going to need big data, but it's still going to have to come back to the ground at some particular point. I mean, Tom, for example, spoke about the desire at some particular point to have that interaction with the pediatrician focused on parenting and things that are truly mattering. And part of the problem is, and Tom alluded to this, we all know about this clinically, is that you've got a list of screens or boxes that you need to check off during that short period of time. So one of the things you can do if you're collecting data in the real life is to have that fed into the clinician prior to the time that people actually show up, so you can perhaps focus on some things and get to know your individual patient better than through that short 7 to 15 minutes that you actually have. So that'll change the nature, but I think it's going to come down to knowledge. It's going to come down to being able to understand where is that individual child in space, what are the prospects, and how do we deal with that? It's the ability to collect a lot of information, mobilize it, but towards exactly the same question that every one of you showed up here today to ask. What can we do for an individual child that's sitting in front of us?
Right. And is there a way that research now and in the future is going to be able to have an impact to change the way these systems are operating? Because that seems to be part of the conversation as well, that we have to figure out ways in which we communicate what we're finding in research to be able to make sea changes in the way that medicine is practiced, the way that education is administered, the way that family support is occurs in terms of available programs. How is research going to speak to that, right? Because we have a lot of knowledge, and we're still, the joke I made earlier today about, the first thing we took out of our education system is the easiest thing, movement. We heard about that multiple times, and physical activity, which we have a biological basis for. It's not just, a silly activity. It actually is meaningful in terms of health, physical and mental health.
I think there's an area where some of the Europeans are way ahead of us. So one of the issues that a few people touched on today, we talked a lot about parent-child relationships, be they mother and child or father and child relationship. We talked, and I think Sonia's touched on the issue of the burden that parents actually face. Parenting and family function occurs in a communal context. It occurs in a community. And many of the things that get in the way of parents being able to offer the love and affection and nurturance to their children is the incredible burden under which they operate in their daily lives that gets in the way. We need to step back from the family and start thinking about the context within which that's occurring. Can we restructure our communities, for example, to offer better life-work balances between parents and their children and families? Can we put daycares in better proximity to the workspace? Can we make transportation better? Can we offer services across a wider range of our public rather than those who are economically advantaged and solely? I think we're going to have to broaden the discussion to start putting it into a context that involves the community, and to have community leaders understand that the children who are the product of this, those are the people paying the bills further down the line. And as somebody mentioned, they do become adults, right? We have to connect to the forces that define our community and the life within our community, because families operate within that context.
I mean, I totally agree with this, but I think we shouldn't forget, so there are these factors now that have really popped into consciousness. So one is, the whole area of nutrition for the first time has become a real science, which up to now is really not something that I ever paid attention to. You say send somebody to a dietitian, but now I think because
when you went to medical school, did you
Zero.
have a class on nutrition?
Zero.
You did.
Yeah.
You did.
That's amazing.
That's because you're Canadian.
And then the other thing is, with
Quebec, we eat.
So there's other things going on which I think we need to take into account in these models. So the diversity of our gut microbiome has been going down consecutively over the last 50 years. So the ecosystem inside of us is going through the same process as our environment is going through. And if you sort of apply the same kind of ecological science to this, so you would expect it's decreasing resilience and greater risk for major catastrophic events. I personally think that this C. difficile dramatic increase is an indication of that. I think the obesity epidemic is similar. So there's things going on that we in the traditional psychiatric and developmental models have not really put into the equation. They're not the cause of these problems, but they're a major modulatory factor, and I think that is important. It's a new thing, I think, that will happen.
I'd like to say that I fully agree with what you say, that we need to enlarge our knowledge to include other components, and I think what we would need to include in the future is the humanities, values and philosophy and the arts and humanities into science. Like if you think about 500 years ago in the time of Leonardo da Vinci, one person can hold together all the knowledge of his time, philosophy and science and medicine. And then we compartmentalized into different branches of knowledge, and we accumulated so much knowledge that it's impossible for one person to hold it together. And I think this was beautifully exemplified by all the talks today, that people spoke about the whole child. And they spoke about their research in ways that made sense to anyone to hear. We could understand what everybody is talking about. And I think we're going to have to step back, look at a whole child, and then put into our knowledge also values and moral judgment and the arts and some kind of a holistic integration of everything we know from science, from neuroscience, from the microbiome, from all elements of science. And that's going to be a huge challenge, to step back and then take an integrative view of what kind of human beings we want to raise.
And I would say is, what's crossed my mind a lot is that the more we're able to measure and identify, the more complicated we realize things are. On the other hand, we also, at each level that we've talked about now, and certainly when I mentioned the team science, that at every different level, at a molecular level, the relationship between cells, the relationship between organ systems, the relationship between, I think about it, the bugs that I have in my, and everything else going on, and the relationships that we've all touched upon. The ultimate relationship in terms of what's the future for where we're going in terms of the science are in fact the relationships that scientists, researchers, clinicians, educators, health professionals, and those who are in the humanities and social science are going to be able to develop with each other, right? And to me, that's probably the most difficult challenge, because we're all a little bit uncomfortable when we get outside of our own space, our own domain of expertise. So somehow we have to figure out, I think, since I hosted today, I'll have to do the last word. We have to figure out how we reward those interactions so that we're not afraid to step together with others who have different expertise and feel comfortable in that, in not knowing things and depending upon others to sort of move this in a much more rapid way, and understand that everybody who would contribute, that I mentioned, has value. Value, not rank order, but real value. So I want to...
Yeah, I mean, one of the
He's got the last word.
I mean, one of the caveats about this is, so in the academic model, academia has not adapted to this model yet. The study sections, when you send in these big data grants, they say it's fishing expeditions, you have to have a hypothesis. The second one is if this grant comes and it's divided equally between different departments, the department chair will insist it's going to go through my department because I want the overhead. So that's a big obstacle. And I think that's why some of these startups and companies have an advantage, because they bypass this.
Yeah, well, they're in a big open space. And so that's, so we're going to, before we end, I just want to say a few things. First, to thank Vicki and Ron Sims, who are sitting right there. This is just another fabulous day. I want to on behalf of everybody here, unless they're willing to wait and you come down one by one like at a wedding line, thank all of the scientists who participated today. It was fabulous. And to all the awardees who came, and those who have won awards in the past who continue to come, thank you, because it enriches the environment. And go forth and solve all our problems. Thank you very much.